Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see it right now. So hi and welcome. Great to see that so many participants signed up for this session. And I hope everyone has had a great conference so far and successful partnering sessions. Today, we're going to be talking about valuation, and we're gonna attack one of the most dreaded questions a biotech CEO can get in a negotiation, and that is, what is your valuation really based on? And even though this is often asked, we all know that it's not possible to foresee what the future will look like. But our goal is to make these predictions less about guessing and more about using data-driven assumptions. So that's what I'm gonna be talking about today. So here's the agenda that we're gonna go through today. And I will try to keep this to roughly 45 minutes so we can try to avoid the Zoom fatigue we've all heard about and felt in very, very long sessions in videos. And we're going to start off by just saying a few words about who we are, MS&C Nordics, and what we do. Then we're going to move into valuation mechanics and give some background for those who haven't really encountered valuation as much before and just what it is. And then we're going to go into the whys. Why would you need a valuation model? After that, we're moving into common mistakes that are made that we frequently see when we do valuations or are in negotiations. And then we're going to finalize this by looking into how you can plan your negotiation and some tips that you can use. And we're going to try and set aside some time in the end to do Q&A. So feel free to add your questions in the chat while I talk. I think that would be the easiest way, and then we'll collect them all in the end. And if you would like us to follow up with you separately after this workshop, just let us know in the chat as well, and we can make that happen, of course. So with that, I'm going to get started. So the team who's here today on the call from our side is Stine Birk Hansen, who's our senior management consultant with a long experience in finance and strategy consulting across multiple industries. We have Shin Sun Lee, who is our senior associate and valuation specialist, track record within business development, procurement, and who's extremely skilled at building valuation models. Myself, I'm Tobias Thornblad. I'm co-founder of MS&C Nordics, as well as Monocle, which is now a definitive healthcare-owned software as a service company within the medical affairs space, and Biostock, which you might have heard of, which is a leading news outlet for the Nordic biotech industry. In spite of our name, we serve clients from across all Europe with a particular focus on the Nordic biotech space. Our primary clients are biotech companies, but we do have customers across multiple other life science categories, but we're life science specific. We are indication agnostic, and we work with all major disease groups as well as a bunch of rare diseases. So in addition to evaluation services, we offer strategy consulting assignments where our ultimate goal is to empower biotech companies to either strike strategic partnerships or attract investments. And this typically means that we're involved in anything from business plans, investment presentations, market research, communication, project management, and much more. We recently conducted a study in collaboration with the Karolinska Institute, where we interviewed executives to better understand valuation from the biopharma side. And I think that's a nice way to start this before we move into the valuation, because what we wanted to understand was what their perspective is, since these are the people that we meet on the other side of the virtual table in these negotiations. So our focus was on conducting interviews to get qualitative data with larger biopharma companies. So we talked to company leaders across the US, Germany, France, UK, and Scandinavia. And the executives we talked to had titles from business development, licensing, new ventures, external alliances, and similar areas. And this resulted in a white paper, and we're happy to send this free of charge if you just drop us an email. We're also going to post it in the virtual booth, I hope today or possibly tomorrow. And I'm just going to start off by mentioning some of the key takeaways that we found in the study. So one of the interviewers said, "Preparation is everything. Pharma invests a lot of time into an asset before a deal is negotiated. So should you." So this is one of the key themes, obviously, for this workshop today. Another one said that more than half of the discussions that results in deals stem from outreach done by the pharmas themselves. This means invest in your visibility. And a third one said, pharma expects biotechs to have done their discounted cash flow analysis to be able to answer detailed questions. The actual calculated value is not the end goal, but the assumptions to get there are what matters. So this plays quite well in what we're going to talk about today, I think. But first, let's rewind the tape and start with an intro to valuation. What is it really and how does it work? So we're going to start off by looking at this. This is probably familiar to most people on this call. This is what I would call the anatomy of the cash flows related to drug development. So if we start on left-hand side, we start in a discovery or preclinical stage before moving through each of the clinical phases to hopefully launch a market-approved drug in the end. If we then add a legend to all these colors, then we have a high-level overview of costs and revenues. And as you probably notice, all the annual bars on the left-hand side are on the negative side on the x-axis. And this is obviously because we have mostly costs at this stage. In addition to overhead costs to run the company, we would expect costs related to acquiring an asset to start up the company and costs associated with that. But we also have costs for CMC and running the actual R&D program, preclinically and clinically. And the closer we come to the market approval, the more costs we will have related to post-marketing costs for sales and marketing related to launch and distribution of the drug. So hopefully this is balanced by a really steep revenue curve based on a quick market uptake, which you see in purple in this slide. So if we start with the cash flows that are pre-market, then what we would do, we typically spend a lot of time on estimating both the timing and the size of each pre-market cash flow. Sometimes this is easier than done, and often this is easier said than done, to be honest. And there seems to be a natural law for studies to start later than estimated and for costs to end up in a higher range than the CROs initially proposed, as we all know. So what we typically end up doing is that we try to manage this through scenario planning, where we simulate delays and costs becoming higher than we originally planned. But it's still an exercise that needs to be done in order to do the calculation. Then we move into the post-market cash flows. These need to be estimated as well. And if you thought that R&D costs were difficult to predict, then you're in for a new challenge in this realm. This means that we have to estimate future revenues. And in order to estimate that, we need to look at the size of the target patient population. We look into drug pricing, the market uptake, dosing frequency, drug adherence, and much more in order to estimate how much money will we make in each year on the market. And at the same time, you obviously have a lot of costs for producing the drug, to market the drug, and to sell the product. When we have estimated all of these cash flows, then we need to discount them. And for those of you who have not encountered this term before, it essentially translates to the time value of money. An example would be if you receive 100 euros today or tomorrow in exchange for something, you probably accept that the value is 100 euros. However, if you're offered to be paid 100 euro for the same thing, but you're going to get the money in 2 years' time, you probably would argue that you would like some extra compensation for the long wait. So essentially, money in the future is worth less than money that you receive now. So what you see in this slide is the formula that you use in order to calculate the present value of each of those cash flows. So now things get a bit interesting and much more biology oriented or life science oriented. Success, as we all know in drug development, relies on underlying biology, meaning that projects can fail. And in fact, many projects do fail. So the development risk of moving through clinical phases, it's often referred to attrition. And all you need to worry about at this stage is that at an early stage, a project has a lower likelihood of approval than at a later stage project. So these attrition rates then vary based on project type, indications, and a whole range of other factors. And we need to calculate this in order to come up with a reasonable value of a project. Here you see the full equation. And if you've calculated all your annual cash flows and discounted each of them to get their present values, you can then net these to get your net present value. So that would be the right-hand side of the full equation here. But what you have to do, obviously, is to add your investments and costs in the same year as you're doing the valuation for. since the time value of money doesn't affect anything in the same year as your calculation. That's the left-hand side of the equation, the I0. Finally, we apply the attrition as a development risk probability that the project will make it all the way to the market, which is represented by the purple letter R in the equation. And congrats, you arrived at the risk-adjusted net present value for the project. So this is essentially how it's done mathematically. But now to the more interesting question: why would you need one of these in the first place? So creating a valuation model that you believe in, it will certainly take some time because it's complicated and there are a lot of assumptions to go through before you arrive at this goal. However, it's like that old saying we usually say, that it's more about the journey there rather than the journey that, rather than where the journey leads you. And we think that the valuation, it forces you to define your target patient population, which is a very good thing to control and have defined in detail. Same thing is that it forces you to address the size of your addressable market and really think about what is your competitive edge against the pipeline and marketed drugs. Moreover, it creates a natural forum to discuss market and development assumptions. In our experience, sometimes this is actually the first time that the CEO, CMO, CSO, and CFO have a focused discussion around the full lifetime of a specific asset. And by just having this conversation and discussing all the assumptions in details, it creates a consensus. And it's good to have that before you go into discussion with potential partners and investors, because then you at least agree internally on what you believe in very important questions. Sometimes we like to illustrate the foreseen development of your anticipated valuation curve against your budget. And this is what you see in this picture. And the goal is obviously to ensure that the valuation largely outpaces your burn rate to secure a return on investment for your shareholders. A well-built valuation model, it can identify your key value drivers and triggers of an asset so that you can craft your partnering or financing strategy. So this might be used in order for you to identify the optimal timing for when to do investment rounds, possibly when to do an IPO, or when to partner your drug, or any type of M&A where you might want to in-license something or out-license something. So it gives you a timing perspective of your valuation, which is good. When you take this to the next step and have individual valuations done for all of your assets, you can use this as a way to manage your portfolio. This shows you what assets that hold the highest value as one thing, but may also give you clues on what to out-license early versus what to hold on to for a bit longer. So another assessment may be to determine your portfolio risk. Are multiple assets depending on each other? And if one fails, will all fail? Some of our CEO clients also use this as a tool to communicate the value to their board of directors and as a basis when recommended M&A decisions. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts. So we encounter some very impressive companies with extremely high potential, but we also encounter some mistakes that can be easily avoided. So we thought it would be interesting to show a few common mistakes. And we're gonna jump into the first one right away. So the first mistake is to not apply generally accepted methodologies and models. And we would say that it's a mistake to enter into partnering without having done your homework based on cash flow analysis or risk-adjusted net present value calculation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this was confirmed also in the interviews we did with pharma. And what's good to know is that the RNPV method is commonly used across large pharma and valuation experts and has been standardized across the industry by leading management consulting firms for decades. So our recommendation would be inventive with your assets, not your valuation method. It's also important to remember to risk adjust. This is sometimes challenged in our projects by board members who don't have previous experience from the biotech industry. But again, this is common practice and expected. Your calculated RNPV need to be adapted for your specific negotiation in order and also to reflect the discount rate of your counterparty. The total value of the RNPV is typically then shared with the counterparty when a deal is proposed, and this is not the price tag of your project. That's also a common misconception that we encounter. In very early stages or in fields with new emerging technologies, it's actually more common to use comparable deals with similar characteristics as guide for how to structure licenses and guide the valuation. However, in our experience, this does not mean that an RNPV will be useless, but rather that it may have less impact on the final terms and the final value that is agreed upon. The next mistake that we encounter is not using data-driven assumptions for key drivers. Doing your homework around evaluation typically means doing a lot of benchmarking and market research. A common mistake we see is when you do too wide market segmentations. So this would make the estimated market size too broad. And while this might look good for the total value, because you end up at a very, very high sum, it will be challenged and probably not accepted by the counterparty. So it's better to estimate the market size in a more narrow and conservative way, because this makes it difficult to disregard as unrealistic. So an example would be that instead of saying that we're targeting autoimmune diseases, you would go for a specific disease, such as rheumatoid arthritis, as an example. And in that disease, you have to qualify what target patient population are you targeting. The next thing that we typically encounter a lot of misconceptions about is market share. Some clients start out by arguing that they will achieve 100% market penetration, since there are no good treatment options on the market, or because they target a rare patient population. And our answer is typically that few, if any, products achieve complete market dominance. There will always be some patients that don't wish to receive the drug or can't afford it or won't get it for other reasons. So we recommend benchmarking with a similar drug, and this will make you see that there are very few drugs that have that high market penetration. So then you will probably come up with a much more likely number. In the slide, we've also listed a few things to consider when estimating the planned pricing, because obviously you probably want to have it as a premium price, but there are more things to think about when you set that price and benchmark against other drugs. Third mistake. The obvious risk when you work too much on your model is that you make it more theoretical than practical. Too many high resolution assumptions, it may result in a false sense of accuracy. The level of details in assumptions should optimally not be too different across different data points in the model input. So it may be a good idea to indicate your level of certainty for important assumptions. This enables you to revisit these as new insights emerge and evolve. And in negotiations, honesty and transparency may be used as tools to build trust. So we think that that's a good thing. They can show what you're really, really certain about and what you are willing to discuss different assumptions about. We also feel that diagrams and flowcharts are usually a good way to illustrate how you've arrived at important assumptions. This makes it easier to discuss with the counterparty if you disagree on the market opportunity. And valuation is complex, but by using flowcharts, you can actually make it a much more, the overview will be much better for the counterparty. So if we then move into the actual negotiation, we think that you should prepare it in detail. And 3 easy steps to be better prepared for negotiations are to start off by identifying your weak points in your model and assumptions, and try to simulate what the counterparty's perspective is on your asset. And then also use the counterparty's probably bearish view to your advantage, if it's possible. So we'll try to illustrate this now. So if we start off by looking at the weak points. So one way to identify your weak points is to look at your assumptions and see which ones that have support in peer-reviewed publications. These will be difficult to argue against. So for your assumptions where you have no references, the obvious thing would be to look if you can find supporting data to strengthen them before you go into negotiation. Another way is also to do a sensitivity analysis where you simulate what happens when you increase or decrease your values for different assumptions. These will obviously affect the valuation, and by identifying your key drivers, you know what to focus on. In an optimal world, you want to have the most research done to support your key valuation drivers. Now let's assume a scenario. So this is a scenario where you've received a term sheet and the proposed royalty is 10%. So if we just disregard all other factors, because obviously there will be a lot of other factors to consider, but let's just consider this factor now. You, in this case, you're the biotech executive. You're convinced that your asset will exceed 1 billion euros a year at peak. Your counterparty is not as convinced about this. They believe that your asset will top out at 750 million per year. We're going to try and use this to our advantage. When both of the parties have done their calculations based on the 10% royalty, we have made the calculation that we're going to make 913 million euros in royalty streams. The counterparty has calculated at the same time, since they have a different curve, they have arrived at that they're going to have to pay 617 million euros for the same revenue. So let's use this to our advantage. So we decide to ask for a tiered royalty, where the first tier is 8% up to 750 million euros per year, and the second tier is 15% for everything above. So now let's see how this affects your and the counterparty's valuation model. If everything else remains constant, this actually decreases the amount of royalties that the pharma expects to pay to you, while in your model, you'll receive higher royalty streams since you now have a higher total percentage. Of course, no one knows what's going to happen in practice, but in negotiation, we now have something that's a win-win. Both parties would be eager to accept this because both parties have had has better numbers in front of them. So we are actually on time. So I'm just going to mention a few words on how you can learn more about valuation before we move into the Q&A session. So if you're like me, a bit nerdy and prefer to read more on the topic, we have recently released a book through the website where we've captured our thoughts and best practice about valuation methodology. So feel free to check that out if you want to learn more. We also offer online courses via Zoom in a very similar format to this one. And we have an introduction course that's currently planned on 13th of October. Easy also to sign up through our website under MS&C Academy. And with that said, I'm just going to have a look here. I don't think we have a lot of questions at the moment. So if you don't mind, I can probably use or mention a few of the most commonly asked questions instead. So one of the most common questions that we get is, when is the optimal timing to actually do a valuation? And our answer is usually to do it as early as possible. And that is because you want to prepare as much as possible when it comes to coming to conclusions about your development path, and to come to a consensus together with your management team about what direction to go for. And when partnering is a fact, then you should be secure about all the assumptions that you've made. So that's one of the most frequently questions. If someone has any questions at this point, feel free to use that little emoticon hand to raise, or use the chat. Great, so now I can see. Yes, so now we have a few questions. So how about taking reimbursement into account when thinking about the different markets you will target? That's a very good question. Usually, I think it depends on the stage you're at. if you're a very early stage biotech, we usually don't take that into account. But the more later stage you are, and the more we would focus on individual markets, that's certainly something that we would take into account. It's a difficult thing to take into account because you can't take it for granted, of course, but we will model that as one of the assumptions, as the other assumptions would be added onto it. Inputs about medtech valuation versus biotech. I think that what we've said today, it mostly applies to biotech, just because of the reasons of the development paths, etc. In our experience, the medtech companies, their valuations are usually based on sales. To a certain extent, of course, you won't have sales as a start, but when you sell the company, in our experience, usually you would have a multiple based on the EBITDA that you produce, which means that it has a high reliance on other valuation methods or complementary valuation methods. For early stage medtech companies, we've also done similar to this, different types of net present value calculations, but there's not as much statistics related to development risk. So that would have to be modeled a bit differently. So it's similar, but it's not the same. That's what I would say. At what stage of negotiation do you recommend to contact investment banks? I think it probably depends in which country you're based and what market you're active within. In our experience, we here in the Nordics, I think that usually this comes at a later stage, so probably phase 2, phase 3, and most of these banks, or many of them at least, would have a minimum requirement of the market cap that you have. So it might not be worth it, at least not in Sweden, if you have a market cap less than 1 billion Swedish crowns. So there are more things to consider in this, I would say. So can the panel make some comments on discount rates for NPV calculations? Are there widely agreed standard rates, or do they vary? What factors cause them to vary? Good question. I would say that there is no standard rate. When we do evaluations, typically for small biotech companies, we would apply a discount rate roughly around 18% for a clinical stage biotech, and roughly 20% when we're talking about a preclinical stage biotech company. This is certainly different between if you're an acquiring party, or if you're an investor going into a company, etc. So it varies a lot. We've done a lot of studies in looking at if there are any standards, and those that have been published, they vary a lot. So no, I would say that there is no common standard, and it's difficult to say what is the right discount rate. Usually, in our experience at least, is that the discount rate is higher, of course, when you're an earlier stage company. But if you're going into deal modeling, then you would have to adapt your discount rate based on the other side, so the partner's discount rate, and those numbers are obviously a bit easier to find for bigger companies, where you can actually calculate that in a better way. How do you estimate clinical risk, chances of drug failing at different development stages? So there's a lot of statistics related to this. So in the book, we've actually gathered a lot of them and made different medians and average calculations, but there are plenty of publications on the topic, and there are almost like at least one new paper per year that is released, where they've done really massive studies on different indication categories, molecule types, if it's a rare or non-rare disease, and there are a lot of different classifications. So there's plenty of data to use if you're interested into going into more to that subject. However, of course, there's also the risk, since there's so much data, that you're going to cherry pick the best data. So what we typically do is that we try to calculate an average based on the latest published data there is. So perhaps we take 5 data points or 3 data points or whatever for the same thing, and then we average that and use that as the actual development risk based on something that's very, very close to the asset at hand. Good. I think we're almost at the end of this session in terms of timing, right? I'm just gonna have a look through the questions here. Good comments here, and not a very particular question that I can answer for the whole class, I think. Then I would like to say that we are happy to we're happy to reach out if you have any particular questions that you would like to ask that you're not comfortable asking in front of an audience that is more specific to your drug, of course. And we will be here throughout this conference, so we can do it through the platform, and just reach out to me or Stina or Jen or anyone else on the team. Would also be happy to set up a workshop one-on-one to discuss more particular things around your specific asset as well. And if that was the last question, then I would like to thank everyone for tuning into this session. And it was great to see that many were interested in valuation. Thank you so much for attending.